Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming events.
Welcome, Dr. Rabin.
Thank you. All right, good evening. It's so good to see all of you. I am impressed that you've all made it out on an evening that is cold and snowy, but perhaps what evening would be better for tonight's topic? We've done spells, we've done history of magic, we've done potions. So the one big class left, defense against dark arts. Or, to put it slightly differently, things to do in Britain when you're dead. Because when we talk about the dark arts in the Middle Ages, we can talk about witches' curses, we can talk about the poisons of the alchemist, but really what clutched people's heart, what grasped people's heart with the greatest fear were the dangerous dead and those who manipulated them or used them for their own evil purposes. And so that's what we're going to focus on tonight. And in order to move ourselves into the topic, where to begin, I can't think of any better place than with the opening words of Umberto Eco's phenomenal book, The Name of the Rose, of course, a manuscript. And I want to start with a manuscript from the late 12th or early 13th century that was produced at Byland Abbey, which is now, unfortunately, not much of an abbey anymore. At a certain point in the 12th and 13th century, the monks at Byland Abbey decided they wanted to preserve not just the sort of typical religious texts, theological texts that you find in manuscripts, they also wanted to preserve a set of morality tales. And these morality tales in particular were all ghost stories. Each one of them is phenomenal. If you go out and just sort of Google Byland Abbey ghost stories, they're not very difficult to find. There are lots of different translations of them online. They are a lot of fun. And I just want to start with one of them. The nasty narrative of the corpse who walked. Robert the Younger died and was buried in a churchyard, but he had the habit of leaving his grave by night and disturbing and frightening the villagers. Then some young men of the village talked together and determined to catch him if they possibly could. But when they saw the ghost, they all fled with the exception of two. Of these, one, called Robert Foxton, seized him at the entrance to the cemetery and placed him on the kirk stile, while the other cried manfully, "Keep him fast until I come to you." The first one answered, "Go quickly to the parish priest that the ghost may be conjured, for with God's help I will hold firmly what I've got until the arrival of the priest." And when the ghost had been conjured, the priest arrives, he exorcises the ghost. Robert the Younger's corpse spoke in the inside of his bowels, and not with his tongue, but as it were from an empty cask, and he confessed his different offenses. And when these were made known, the priest absolved him, but charged those who had seized him not to reveal his confession in any way, and henceforth, as God willed, he rested in peace. It is said, moreover, that before his absolution he would stand at the doors of houses and windows and walls, as it were, listening. Some people say that he had been assisting and consenting to the murder of a certain man, and that he had done other evil things of which I must not speak in detail at present. It's a wonderful story, but there are a couple of things I want to highlight. First, note that the fear is linked to, in particular, the movement of the corpse, that he physically has the habit of leaving his grave by night and disturbing and frightening the villagers, that he would actually stand at the doors and houses and doors and windows of houses, essentially at those liminal spaces between the comforting domestic inside and the darkness outside, and he stands there listening. Note also the description of the way in which he speaks. that the corpse does not speak in the way that a normal human would speak, or a living human, but rather from the inside of his bowels, and not with his tongue, but as it were in an empty cask. In essence, what we have here is the idea that this corpse has been possessed by a demon. So this is not necessarily Robert the Younger himself. This is instead some sort of demonic figure that has come and inhabited the corpse. But at the same time, we're told he confessed his different offenses, so this suggests that we do have Robert here. So there's a bit of a tension between the physical presence of the person and the idea that the person's soul or spirit identity has disappeared and has been replaced by that of a demon. And when these were made known, the priest absolved him, but charged those who had seized him not to reveal his confession in any way. Not only does this refer to the secret of the confessional, but also the importance of keeping this narrative secret. As the author says at the end, these things of which I must not speak in detail at present. A second story, this one not from Byland Abbey, but from Bury St. Edmunds. That's St. Edmund there getting beheaded. And this one we will call the terrifying tale of the reeve who walked. It so happened that in the city of Bury St. Edmunds, the local reeve, who also was the judge in charge of the court, decided that he wanted to use the court for self-enrichment. So he selected a woman who had been accused of a crime, and he informed her that unless she paid him an exceptional amount of money, he would find her guilty and she would be executed. The woman, knowing that she would not receive a fair trial, fled in fear to the church of Bury St. Edmunds and the monastic foundation of Bury St. Edmunds, dedicated to Edmund King and martyr. And there, she prayed to the saint for help. The judge followed her with his men. When the judge discovered this, that she had fled, he presently decided on a contest to show which of them was more powerful, the martyr in freeing people or the judge in condemning them. In essence, what we have here is a story about the confrontation between ecclesiastical authority and secular authority. Well, you can probably guess who won. The reeve's men attempt to enter the grounds of the church. They are prevented. The reeve himself is prevented. And because of his temerity, he is struck mad. And we are told that despised in heaven and on earth, he came to a bad end, possessed by a demon in life, then similarly possessed as a corpse in death. Not long held down by the grave's embrace, his body was sewn in a calf skin and sunk in a lake. Such is his monument. So very similar themes to the story that I just told you. And in fact, it very much resembles the witchcraft story that I told last week, in which the witch says that her sons are to sew up my corpse in the skin of a calf. It's very bad to be a calf in the Middle Ages. Lay it on its back in a stone coffin, fasten down the lid with lead and iron. On this, put a stone bound round with 3 chains of enormous weight. One final story, and we'll call this one The Awful Adventure of the Peasants Who Walked. Now, it so happened that 2 peasants who worked for the local landlord decided that they no longer wished to serve him. They were serfs owned by the land, so they fled to the lands of the neighboring landlord, and there they libeled their original lord. And this caused the 2 noblemen to come to blows and to actually take military action against each other, causing loss of life and threat to the local monastery, which was dedicated to Saint Modwina. However, the peasants' perfidy was discovered, and they were struck dead, supposedly by a supernatural blow. But on that very same day on which they were interred, they appeared at evening, while the sun was still up, in the town of Drakelo, carrying on their shoulders the wooden coffins in which they had been buried. The whole following night they walked through the paths and fields of the village, now in the shape of men carrying wooden coffins on their shoulders, now in the likeness of bears or dogs or other animals. They spoke to the other peasants, banging on the walls of their houses and shouting, "Move, quickly, move, get going, come!" When these astonishing events had taken place every evening and every night for some time, such a disease afflicted the village that all of the peasants fell into desperate straits, and within a few days, all except 3, we shall discuss later, perished by sudden death in a remarkable way. These 3 will, in fact, fall ill, but it is only by the discovery of the source of their illness that they will ultimately be cured. Men were living in terror of the phantom dead men who carried their wooden coffins on their shoulders every evening and night, and they received permission from the bishop to go to their graves and dig them up. They found them intact, but the linen cloths over their faces were stained with blood. They cut off the men's heads and placed them in the graves between their legs, tore out their hearts from their corpses, and covered the bodies again with earth. They brought the hearts to a place called Dodesfrisoford. We haven't actually identified that place other than to know that it's really difficult to say. And there burnt them from morning until evening. So here we have 3 ghost tales, or 3 tales of the restless dead, all produced relatively contemporaneously, though all in different parts of England. And there are certain consistent themes or ideas that we see present in each of them. First, there is this strong emphasis on the physicality of the restless dead. These aren't just ghosts. The anxiety isn't just about the reemergence of the spiritual. The emphasis here is on the fact that these are walking corpses, corpses that cannot remain in their grave. Second, there is an odd tension in all of the tales between the idea that the walking corpse is in fact the person who in life had committed some sort of evil deed or acted in such a way as to essentially merit damnation and create the possibility that they could be resurrected in a nasty way, or the idea that the corpse is just a shell being animated by some sort of demon. In some sense, you see many of these tales, just like the first one I told, trying to have both of these ideas at the same time. In each case, the corpse poses a danger to the community. Whether the corpse is standing listening by doors and windows, or to think of the 2 peasants who are walking around spreading disease. In fact, that story gives us a considerable clue as to one of the major sources for tales of the restless dead. The corpses are found in their graves, bloated, with blood covering the face, or blood sort of seemingly having emitted from the mouths. They're actually showing the particular patterns of decomposition associated with the corpses of people who died of tuberculosis. And in fact, many restless dead narratives seem to have originated in moments of disease or periods of pandemic or epidemic, and the decomposition patterns of the corpses can give rise to stories that the corpses actually did rise from the grave and were the source of disease. The restless dead are especially associated with social ills or the disruption of social hierarchy. So you have, say, the reeve who decides he wants to overthrow the authority of the church, or the 2 peasants who threaten the hierarchy of the feudal system. And in that sense, the corpses are reflective not simply of the individual evil of the person who might be rising from the dead, they are, in fact, in some sense, emblematic of larger social problems or anxieties. In that sense, you might even think of them as ways similar to the way in which we think of somebody like Stephen King, whose stories or novels typically explore anxieties related to nostalgia and alcoholism and the dangers of everyday objects like an old car or an angry dog. People are doing the same things in the Middle Ages. And finally, the necessity that the corpse must be constrained. In order to prevent the restless dead from traveling, there has to be some sort of way of ensuring that the body does not leave the grave. And the wonderful thing about this is we have actually a great deal of archaeological evidence for the various ways in which people tried to ensure that corpses not leave the grave. One of my favorites here, in this burial, there's actually a blade that was put across the neck of the corpse so that if the corpse decided to sit up, his head would fall right off. It's not uncommon to see corpses' mouths blocked with something so that they cannot, in some sense, suck the blood, if we want to think of this in terms of vampire legends, though I very much want to sort of avoid the V word for the rest of this talk. But they also cannot in any way either receive sustenance or have their spirit escape through their mouths. And interestingly, this is a practice that has not died out. So for instance, among the Karelian people of the Baltic states, or northern Finland and Russia, here we have a Karelian ceremony. It's a Christian ceremony, but once again, the corpse has to have his mouth blocked up. Also popular, burying a corpse in a prone position, that is, facing downwards. Essentially, the idea is that if the corpse decides to wake up and start digging his way out, he's going to just sort of dig his way further down. And we can chuckle about it, but this is a detail from 15th century Flemish painting of the Deposition of Christ. And this is one of the thieves, the thief who did not repent. And you notice he is going into the ground here in a prone position. There is the removal of the head and the sort of muddling up of the rib cage area, possibly to get at the heart. Simply disarticulating the body generally. One of my favorites, you have, if you really want to be sure, you've cut the corpse's legs so it cannot walk. You have detached the cranium and sort of rolled it away from the body. And then you've put mortar on top of the grave, large rocks on top of the mortar, and then more mortar on top of the large rocks. This guy is not going anywhere. One you may be more familiar with, nailing a corpse to the grave. Very practical. You can do it with Home Depot. But this survives also in the idea that the restless dead have to have a stake put through their heart. The idea is not just the damage to the heart. The stake is actually nailing Dracula down into his coffin. So, if you watch Buffy the Vampire Slayer and they're sort of throwing these stakes around, that actually wouldn't have been terribly effective because the body is still up and walking around. Another practice that actually still remains part of contemporary culture is the removal of the coffin before a funeral from the house, not through the door, but through the window, to ensure that the corpse not find its way back into the house. This is still a practice in parts of the Philippines. I want to emphasize the international quality of many of these practices, because they are found throughout Europe and elsewhere as a sign, actually, of cultural exchange. And the interesting thing is, if we chart them out on a map, there's actually a pattern. So we might call this the vampire belt. But it's essentially, the practices that I've talked about are found in this diagonal of cultures, reflecting the idea that if we think about the Middle Ages as a period in which people are essentially isolated, that there isn't a lot of international trade or communication, this is yet more evidence that that's simply not the case. These practices spread essentially along what seem to have been common trade routes during the Middle Ages. So just as goods and texts pass from one community to another, so too do practices dealing with the restless dead. Now, if you fear that the dead are going to come after you for any reason, or if somebody is going to perhaps send an evil spirit after you, there are practices that you can use to avoid that eventuality, to protect yourself. The term for this is apotropaic magic. Essentially, this is defensive magic. So if you want to defend yourself against the dark arts, take notes now. One common practice was the use of what we call witch marks. Essentially, they're little carvings, often in this sort of floral shape, that you find on doorposts or the lintels of doorways. And the idea is that these have the power to prevent a corpse or prevent a curse from following you into the house, perhaps prevent a walking corpse or an evil spirit. Of course, one of the other associations with the restless dead is the idea that they have to be invited in to a house. A symbol like this was thought to have the power of preventing that. It was also not uncommon to wear amulets of different kinds. So here we have a basilisk, the idea being that you protect yourself with an image of something that encapsulates or symbolizes that which you fear. So if you fear that somebody is trying to kill you or that some evil spirit has it out for you, you actually have the image of a basilisk, a poisonous creature, to protect you from the poison coming from the outside. Here's just another example of a little amulet. I rather like this one just because we have an image of a person here, though it's difficult to tell what they're doing. But again, the idea is you wear your defense. We saw some spells last time that you might cast, or some other sort of symbolic practices you might engage in, such as the eating of radishes that might prevent the work of somebody who's hostile to you and using magic. But amulets were probably the most common way in which people warded off the defense or the restless dead. You might wear it. You might bury it with a relative to protect their corpse from being inhabited or possessed by a demon. You might, as we saw, put it on your gates. You might position it in symbolic places around your property. But the idea is that the presence of this object will in some way ensure both the defense of your house against some sort of external evil and the preservation of the health and well-being of those inside. This is actually a practice that many of you may already be familiar with, because it remains a common practice in contemporary Judaism based on the passage in Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and with all your might. And these words which I command you this day shall be in your heart, and you shall repeat them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when we sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up, and you shall bind them for a sign upon your hand. The use of tefillin among Orthodox Jewish communities. They shall be seen as a token before your eyes. Again, the use of the forehead tefillin. And you shall write them upon the doorposts of your house and on your gates. The mezuzah. As we've seen multiple times in this class, there is very little distinction often between religious practices and supernatural practices. And here we have just one way in which what were sort of originally practices acknowledging or trying to engage with the supernatural, surviving as cultural practices or practices that have been turned into what we would now consider modern religious ritual. But here's the thing. If the dead rise up on their own, there are lots of ways to protect yourself. But what you really want to know is what causes the dead to rise up on their own. It may be a demon, it may be an evil spirit, but it may also be somebody practicing evil magic, necromancy. When we talk about the dark arts in the Middle Ages, really, necromancy is what we're talking about. Necromancy has two connected etymologies. First, obviously, the necro there, so magic or divination practiced using the dead, but it's also associated or rewritten often as nigromancy, essentially black magic. So if you were asking beforehand, where does the term black magic come from? Right there, this idea of necromancy. How did people think of necromancy in the Middle Ages? Well, this is what the humanist Johannes Hartlieb wrote. Nigromancy is the first forbidden art and is called the black art. This art is the worst of all because it proceeds with sacrifices and services that must be rendered to the devils. One who wishes to exercise this art must give all sorts of sacrifices to the devils and must make an oath and pact with the devils. Then the devils are obedient to him and carry out the will of the master as far as God permits them. Take note of the two great evils in this art. The first is that the master must make sacrifices and tribute to the devils, by which he denies God and renders divine honors to the devils. For we should make sacrifices only to God, who created us and redeemed us by his passion. And the other is that he binds himself with the devil, who is the greatest enemy of all humankind. If you're curious what this actually looked like, here's an example. This is a 15th century spell summoning the devils to do your bidding, or summoning devils or demons to do your bidding. When you wish to infuse a spirit into a dead person so that he appears alive as he was previously, this is the procedure to follow. First, have a ring made of gold. Around the outside, these names should be carved: Brimmer, Suberith, Tronowit. On the inside, these names: Liroth, Barian, Damon. When the names have been carved on a Sunday before sunrise, go to running water. Again, we have this association of water and magic, and running water and magic, and place the ring in it and let it remain there for 5 days. On the 6th day, take it out and take it to a tomb and place it inside so that it remains there on Friday and Saturday. On Sunday, before sunrise, go outside of the town under a clear sky in a remote and secret place and make a circle with a sword, and on it write with the sword the names and figures that appear here. It's a long spell. Dealing with the devil is complicated business. Also, if the devil doesn't show up, now you have a good excuse. You didn't follow all of the steps perfectly. When this has been inscribed, enter into it the circle, as is designated, and place the sword beneath your knees, and facing south, recite this conjuration. I conjure you, all the demons inscribed in this ring, which you should have in your hand, by the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and by Almighty God, maker of heaven and earth. And notice here, this is a great example of the way in which you have this interconnection between religion and magical practice. You are, at this point, summoning demons or devils from hell. How do you do it? You invoke the name of God. Because, of course, who else would have power to do such a thing? That all of you, constrained and bound to my will and my power, should proceed hither in benign form, so that I will not fear, and should consecrate this ring in such a way that it may possess this power, namely, that whenever I place it on the finger of a dead man, one of you will enter him, and he will appear alive as before, in the same likeness and form. When you have said this once, 6 spirits will once appear in the circle, requesting the ring which you will give them. When you have given it, they will depart, and you likewise should leave the circle, taking the sword with you and not destroying the circle. On the 6th day, return with the sword and say, facing south, I conjure you, O Brimer, Suberith, etc., that you should come to me now without delay, bearing the consecrated ring, so that when I place it on the finger or in the hand of a living person, he will fall to the ground as if dead, and when I take it away, he will return to his former state. And when I place it on a dead person, as aforesaid, a spirit will enter him, and he will appear alive as before. This is it, I promise. When you have done all of this 4 times, first towards the south and likewise towards the west, and then towards the north and towards the east, you will see towards the east someone coming on horseback who, when he arrives at the circle, will say, so-and-so, naming the names as written above, sends you this consecrated ring, but they say they cannot come to you because it is not fitting. You will experience or test the power of the ring, and if it does not have the power that you requested, they say they are prepared to come to you whenever you wish. So you will take the ring, saying to him, thanks to you and to them. When you have said this, he will at once withdraw, and you too shall stand, or you shall depart from the circle, destroying it completely. Keep this ring with you, wrapped in a sheet of white cloth. When you wish to cause somebody to appear dead, so that he will seem to everyone devoid of life, place this ring on his finger, and he will appear to be a corpse, and when you remove it, he will return to his former state, and if you wish a corpse to appear animated, do the same thing. Within an hour, it will arise to the form to which was previously accustomed, and will speak before all with a living voice, and will be able to display this quality for 6 days. For each of these spirits will remain in it for a day, and if you wish it to be as previously before the assigned terminus, remove the ring, and in this manner you can revive a dead person. This most worthy experiment is to be kept hidden, because it holds great power. This is a lengthy and complicated procedure. And in fact, what I've put up on the projection is, believe it or not, an abbreviation. But it tells us a number of really interesting things. On the one hand, it presents, again, a useful reiteration of many of the beliefs and practices we've seen already. So, for instance, the interspersal of the religious and other magical practices. There is the use of running water as a means of purification. Put the ring in the running water and leave it there for 5 days. The idea that the corpse actually is revived physically, and that it is done so by or through the means of demonic possession. We also see a number of different kinds of magical practices being incorporated. We see the use of the magic circle as a mode of protection. The idea that demons have these sort of elaborate foreign-sounding names, as we've seen several times in this class. One of the ways in which you make something sound magical or evil or questionable, you give it a foreign-sounding name. One of the interesting features of the development of medieval literature is that once you hit the 12th century, you start seeing more demonic names that resemble not Latin words, but Arabic words. Why? Because you have a new group of people to demonize in the Crusades. There's also the idea that this language is very much legal. When you engage in a spell like this, you're not just summoning a demon or invoking a certain power, you're making a legal deal. You are making a contract. Interestingly, some of these contracts, in fact, survive. So here, for instance, is one from 1634. It's attributed to Father Urbain Grandier, who was prosecuted among the witches of Loudun, if you've heard of that particular event or read the magnificent Aldous Huxley book about it. This was attributed to him. He didn't write it. It was fake evidence that was sort of forged for the purposes of his trial. And it says, we, the influential Lucifer, the young Satan, Beelzebub, Leviathan, Elamy, and Astaroth, together with others, have today accepted the covenant pact of Urbain Grandier, who is ours. And him do we promise the love of women, the flower of virgins, the respect of monarchs, honors, lusts, and powers. He will go whoring 3 days long. Interestingly, one of the other common features of these spells or contracts is a strict time limit. So the corpse will rise for 6 days. Here, he can go whoring for 3 days. Seems like the corpse had the better deal here. The carousel will be dear to him. He offers us once in the year a seal of blood under the feet. He will trample the holy things of the church, and he will ask us many questions. With this pact, he will live 20 years happy on the earth of men, and will later join us to sin against God, bound in hell in the council of demons, Lucifer, Beelzebub, etc., the seals placed the devil, the master, and the demons, princes of the Lord, by Baalberith, who is apparently our author and a demon himself. Now, this one is deliberately mocked up as a forgery, but that doesn't mean that real ones don't exist, or at least ones that people produced believing them to be real. So here we have one by a fellow named Christoph Heisman from 1669. I'm not sure what it says, but it's actually written in blood. Here's another one, more recent, from about 1818 by the demonologist Jacques Collin de Plancy, which is actually written backwards and in Latin. De Plancy is actually a fairly interesting figure in the history of demonology. In the early 19th century, he produces a number of texts on demons that remain very influential among a certain sort of community of people, especially people like Aleister Crowley and other later 20th century demonologists and those fascinated with the dark arts. However, he scared himself a bit too much. And in 1830, being so terrified by what he had written, he converts to Catholicism just to protect himself. Now, when we talk about demonology, and we talk about contracts with the devil, there's always one name that springs to mind, the name that is most famous for engaging in these practices, and that is Dr. Faust. Made most famous or most well-known through the magnificent play by Christopher Marlowe, but also known through works by Goethe, the wonderful novel by Thomas Mann, in which the Faust legend is used as an allegory for Germany's own deal with the devil in the 1930s and 40s, Nazism. Liszt, Berlioz, Stephen Vincent Benet, The Devil and Daniel Webster, not to mention my favorite of these stories, Damn Yankees. Because whatever Lola wants, Lola gets. This is one of those tales that's sort of baked into Western culture. And so we have to ask, how did it evolve and where did it come from? So the first question is, who actually was Faust? Well, some people have associated him with a printer named Johann Fust, who lived between 1400 and 1466 and may have been attacked for the printing of wrongful or heterodox materials. Of course, one of the anxieties about the age of print is that there is less control over the circulation of texts and more danger from heterodox texts, heretical texts, entering, you might say, the cultural slipstream. Here's the thing. There's actually no evidence connecting Fust with Faust. So one thing we have to do today is clear this man of the libel that he contracted with the devil. He didn't. He just happened to have a similar name. We actually have some better candidates. In fact, two. The early tales of Faust have certain inconsistencies that line up with the lives of two itinerant magicians, astrologers, demonologists, relatively small fry and only really locally known, but nonetheless popular enough to be mentioned in some historical records. One of them is Georg Faust, who was born in Knittlingen, and the other is Johann Faust, born in Heidelberg. In 1484, Georg earned his BA from the University of Heidelberg and his MA in 1487. In 1506, one of these Fausts, probably Georg, was performing magic at Gelnhausen. In 1528, probably the other Faust was actually banished from the city of Ingolstadt for performing magic or defrauding people through magic. And one of them, again, probably in this case Johann, died in 1541, supposedly while practicing as an alchemist, dying in an explosion in the city of Staufen im Breisgau. So these are the few historical traces of the Faust legend. How did it actually become so important and so influential? Well, like most legends, it actually had relatively little to do with Faust himself, or themselves, as the case may be. The most important event in the emergence of the Faust legend is the publication of a chapbook in 1587 called the Historia von Dr. Johann Faustin. In an age in which it's more easy than ever to circulate texts, to circulate stories, and to produce texts for commercial consumption, this is an early bestseller. We don't know why the anonymous author happened to hit on Faust as opposed to any other person, any other name, but nonetheless, it's through this text, which has very little to do with the historical Faust, that Johann Georg Faust, the name is often combined, the two men are combined into one, becomes most famous. It's produced in England just a short time later as The History of the Damnable Life and Deserved Death of Dr. John Faust. And it really is a great read. But it also is a text that has a particular purpose. This is popular literature. It's meant really to do two things: to entertain and to edify. And that shapes the kinds of stories associated with the Faust of this text. We're told that this Faust was a scholar. He had studied all of the major areas of knowledge, so medicine, theology, and law. He found all of them disappointing. But instead, he fell into such fantasies and deep cogitations that sometime he would throw the scriptures from him as though he had no care of his former profession. He accompanied himself with diverse practices that were seen in those devilish arts, and that had the Chaldean, Persian, Hebrew, Arabian, and Greek tongues. If you think all the way back to our first seminar, the association of especially Eastern foreign cultures with dark magic. Here we see it reemerging, using figures, characters, conjurations, incantations, with many other ceremonies belonging to these infernal arts, insomuch that he could not abide to be called Doctor of Divinity, but waxed a worldly man and named himself an astrologian. That's the 16th century term. And so he becomes fascinated and desires to make a deal with the devil. And so he eventually manages to attract the attention of a devil who shows up, and the two of them make a deal. To confirm it the more assuredly, Faust pricked a vein in his left hand, and for certainty thereupon were seen in his hands these words, written as if they had been written in blood, O homo fugae, flee, O man. His own body is telling him not to do this. Whereat the spirit vanished. But Faustus continued in his damnable mind and made his writing as followeth, and this is what Faust's contract looked like. Now have I, Dr. John Faustus, unto the hellish prince of Orient, again, that idea of evil magic coming from the east, and his messenger Mephistopheles, given both body and soul, that they shall teach me and fulfill my desire in all things, as they have vowed unto me. Further, I covenant and grant with them by these presents, that by the end of at the end of 24 years, so again, that time limit, that I then give them full power to do with me at their pleasure, to rule, to send, to fetch, or to carry me or mine, be it either body, soul, flesh, blood, or goods, into their habitation, be it wheresoever. Now you'd think after making a weighty deal like this, Faust would then pursue power, knowledge, ambition. In fact, the sorts of magical things that Faust ends up doing are tremendously petty. So, for one example, amongst the rest, he was desirous to see the Pope's palace and his manner of service at the table. So what he really is interested, of all the things he could know, what does the Pope's table service look like? Pope's got to have great china. Wherefore he and his spirit Mephistopheles made themselves invisible and came unto the Pope's court and privy chamber where he was. There saw he many servants attending on his holiness, with many a flattering sycophant carrying of his meat, and there he marked the Pope and the manner of his service, which he seeing to be so immeasurable and sumptuous, fie, quoth Faustus, why had not the devil made a Pope of me? Could have asked for it. On a time, the Pope would have a feast prepared for the Cardinal of Pavia, and for his first welcome, the Cardinal was bidden to dinner. And as he sat at the meat, the Pope would ever be blessing and crossing over his mouth. Faustus could suffer it no longer, but up with his fist and smote the Pope on the face. And withal he laughed, the whole house might hear him, yet none of them saw him, nor knew where he was. Essentially, Faust becomes a prankster. And in this particular narrative, reflecting the Protestant background of late 16th century Germany, essentially what we have is a little anti-papist fun. Another tale of Faustus: he espied a knight leaning out at a window of the great hall who was fast asleep, for in those days it was hot. Little did they know what was coming. But the person shall be nameless that slept, for that he was a knight, although it was done to a little disgrace of the gentleman. It pleased Dr. Faustus, through the help of his spirit Mephistopheles, to firm upon his head as he slept a huge pair of hart's horns. And as the knight awaked, thinking to pull his head, he hit his horns against the glass, that the pains thereof flew about his ears. Think there how this good gentleman was vexed, for he could neither get backwards or forwards, his head being stuck in a window. So we have a little slapstick humor here, and also a little sort of off-color humor, horns being a symbol in the Renaissance of somebody having been cuckolded. I particularly like this one. Faust decides he's going to sell his horse. So he sold his horse for $40, instructing the person that bought him that he should in no wise ride him over any water. But the horse courser marveled with himself that Faustus bade him ride over no water. But, quoth he, I will prove. And forthwith he rid him into the river. Presently the horse vanished from under him, and he sat on a bundle of straw, insomuch that he almost drowned. The horse courser went angrily to Faustus's inn, where he found him fast asleep and snorting on a bed. Faust was apparently quite a snorer. But the horse courser could no longer forbear him, took him by the leg, and began to pull him off the bed, but he pulled him so that he pulled his leg from his body, insomuch that the horse courser fell down backwards of the place. Then began Dr. Faustus to cry with an open throat, he hath murdered me. Hereat the horse courser was afraid, and gave flight, thinking none other but that he had pulled the leg from his body, and by this means Dr. Faustus kept his horse. So part of the idea that runs through this text is that Faust had infinite power available to him. But that same lack of imagination, that same small-mindedness that caused him to make a contract with the devil initially, caused him to squander that power on basically silly pranks. Of course, the most famous story associated with Faust is that he used his magic to summon Helen of Troy. Here's how that moment is described in the Faust book. To the end that this miserable Faustus might fill the lust of his flesh, it came into his mind in the 23rd year past of his time. Remember, he only has 24, so it took him 23 years to get to sex, which might tell you something wrong with him. That he had great desire to lie with fair Helena of Greece. Wherefore he called unto him his spirit Mephistopheles, commanding him to bring him fair Helena, whereupon he fell in love with her and made her his common concubine and bedfellow, for she was so beautiful and delightful a piece that he could not be 1 hour from her, if he should therefore have suffered death. Look at the language being used about Helen here. She is a common concubine. She is simply a piece. In essence, Faust, this man of such limited imagination, here he has Helen of Troy in front of him. And all he can do is see her as essentially another cheap lay. Faust eventually came to a bad end. It happened between 12 and 1 o'clock at midnight. There blew a mighty storm of wind against the house, as though it would have blown the foundation thereof out of his place. Hereupon the students, Faust still lives at the university, began to fear and got out of their beds, comforting one another, but they would not stir out of the chamber. And the host of the house ran out of doors, thinking the house would fall. The students lay near unto that hall wherein Dr. Faust lay, and they heard a mighty noise and hissing as if the hall had been full of snakes and adders. With that, the hall door flew open, wherein Dr. Faustus was. Then he began to cry for help, saying, "Murder, murder." But it came forth with half a voice hollowly. Shortly thereafter, they heard him no more. So Faust, having squandered these 24 years, having squandered his eternal soul, he dies in a way that is horrifying and a great story, but it's hard to call this tragic or emotionally engaging. What gives the Faust story its power, though, is when Christopher Marlowe comes across the Faust book and he decides he's going to use this tale for his own purposes. And it's with Marlowe's Faust that I want to conclude this talk. I could keep going on up to Damn Yankees, but we won't go that far. Marlowe, writing during the Renaissance, sees in Faust the figure of someone who essentially embodies the humanist values of exploration and learning and essentially testing authority, but is suppressed by the medieval powers that be. And so this is how Marlowe figures his Faust. Faust, having grown tired of all of the areas of learning, he says, "These metaphysics of magicians and necromantic books are heavenly. Lines, circles, letters, and characters, aye, these are those that Faust most desires." See, here, Faust imagines something greater, right? Oh, what a world of profit and delight, of power, of honor, of omnipotence is promised to the studious artisan. And that term is important. Faust is not a scholar here. He is a studious artisan. He is somebody for whom magic is a craft, something he can build with. All things that move between the quiet poles shall be at my command. Emperors and kings are but obeyed in their several provinces, nor can they raise the wind or rend the clouds. But his dominion exceeds in this, stretcheth as far as doth the mind of man. And that is Faust's goal, to stretch as far as the mind of man. A sound magician is a demigod. Here tire my brains to get a deity. For this Faust, the promise of the contract with the devil is the promise of both awesome power and infinite knowledge. Of course, this is a tragedy, and this Faust is brought down by his own arrogance and by his own, well, improper quasi-divine view of himself. But nonetheless, he is represented as essentially the scholar who would learn something new, who would test the boundaries of human knowledge. We see this perhaps most famously in the play when he encounters Helen, who he does not treat as simply a common concubine. And these are perhaps the most famous lines in the play. "Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of Ilium? Sweet Helen, make me immortal with a kiss. Her lips suck forth my soul, see where it flies." Note both the classical allusions, the idea of a depth of emotion. Incidentally, the phrase depth of emotion or depth of first appears in this play, as does, by the way, the word zounds. But also the sexuality of it. Her lips suck forth my soul, make me immortal with a kiss. Come, Helen, come, give me my soul again. Here I will dwell, for heaven is in these lips. And all is dross that is not Helen. I will be Paris, and for love of thee, instead of Troy, shall Wittenberg be sacked. And I will combat with the weak Menelaus, and wear thy colors of my plumed crest, etc., etc., etc. For Faust, the love of Helen turns him into an epic hero, or at least it gives him fancies of being an epic hero. It's a way of essentially love and sexuality driving him to be greater than himself. The exact opposite of the representation of the relationship with Helen in the Faust book. Faust does ultimately come to a bad end, and Marlowe concludes the play with these lines. "Cut is the branch that might have grown full strength, and burned is Apollo's laurel bough. That something grew within this learned man, Faustus, is gone. Regard his hellish fall, whose fiendful fortune may exhort the wise only to wonder at unlawful things, whose deepness doth entice such forward wits to practice more than heavenly power permits." So what is it that Faust really represents here? He's the person who wonders at unlawful things, whose deepness, whose depth of thought prompts him to practice more than heavenly power permits. Faust is the humanist scholar trying to escape from the religious suffocation, of at least what Marlowe sees as religious suffocation of the medieval church and medieval culture. In the play, Faustus himself doesn't actually express his fall in these terms. For Faustus himself, his final line, the last line we hear him say, he blames something else. He says, "If you save me, I will burn my books." So what is it that really leads you to dark magic? Of course, a manuscript. Thank you very much. And thank you all for your attention over the last 4 weeks. If anybody has any questions.
So you said like that part of putting the soul into the corpse is that they call on the power of God. Why would God do that in a post-New Testament world? Why would they imagine that
Part of what these spells are trying to do implicitly is preserve the idea of an omniscient, omnipotent God. It's probably no surprise for me to say that with something that elaborate and arcane, nobody was out there doing this, right? People had magical practices. I'm sure more than one person called on the devil in their own special way. But the sort of elaborate spells or rituals that we find in manuscripts of this sort are probably written, at least in part, as intellectual exercises. Partially for entertainment, partially for the thrill of feeling something that's a little naughty. But really, the people who are writing them are not necessarily Satanists, or are not necessarily people who really believe that they can summon a demon. They enjoy it as, in essence, a thought experiment. And so for them, the idea that God is all-powerful, that's still fine, right? And in that way, you preserve a certain idea of God that something like this could happen in a divine world. There's not some sort of other Manichaeist power that would actually challenge divine power. Other questions? Yes?
I have a two-part question. First, what was generally the background of a necromancer? Were they typically always scholars, or could you kind of come from anywhere? And then based on that, if you decided that you wanted to get into necromancy, how was this information transferred? Like, who do you go to find out these spells?
You actually major in it in college. No, the question was, is there a sort of association of necromancy with scholarship, and how would somebody learn necromancy? To take the first question, the term necromancy is thrown around a lot. So witches being burned at the stake are often accused of necromancy. Really, any kind of dark magic or supernatural practice that people see as evil, threatening, or offensive gets labeled necromancy. The kind of necromancy I've been focusing on, at least in this talk, though, is learned necromancy. That is necromancy that is practiced by scholars, or at least imagined by scholars. That's not necessarily representative. The books we have survive because they're produced by people with both literacy and access to significant resources. So you're dealing with somebody who is either a member of the church, and many of these texts are actually produced in religious settings, or somebody, say, who is of the wealthy merchant class. And so part of what they're doing when they produce texts like this, it is a little bit about showing off your knowledge or gaining a little cultural capital. And that actually answers your second question, how is this knowledge being transmitted? For all the emphasis on secrecy, it's not clear that most of this stuff really was that secret. Every magical text, every alchemical text says that it's supposed to be a secret text, but many of these survive in a tremendous number of copies. It often appears to me when I'm looking at these manuscripts that it's secret in the same way that, say, the book 50 Shades of Grey was secret. Nobody admitted to reading it, but everybody was reading it. So, you know, you might be having a dinner party and bring out your necromantic manuscript, and you can all, sit around a candle and ring a bell or something similar. But you're not actually dealing with, say, a real secret tradition of necromancers that lies below the surface of normative Western culture. Yes?
Is that reflected in the Dominicans or the Inquisition or something like that try to stamp it out, or are they sort of in on the joke?
So the question is, where does the Inquisition sort of fall on the question of necromancy? Are they in on the joke, or do they try to stamp it out? The answer is yes. The Inquisition is, of course, really interested in books like this and in texts like this because it is a sign of evil operating in the world. And say, much of thinking back to last session when we talked about the procedures for interrogation by torture that were set forth in the Malleus Maleficarum, you see similar practices in, say, the Inquisitor's Manual of Bernard Arguy. So there's definitely an overlap, and the idea of a witch persecution is certainly going to be carried out by the Inquisition. At the same time, as I said, many of these texts are being produced in ecclesiastical settings. And if we think back to our second session, where we talked about the association of alchemy with the Franciscan movement, part of what this represents also is internal dissension within the church. The Dominicans don't like the Franciscans, in part because they have very different ideas about the idea or about the poverty of the church, whether the church should be poor or shouldn't. And so that also sort of manifests itself in accusations of witchcraft, accusations of magic, and the persecution of what is called necromancy. Other questions?
In one of your illustrations that had the corpse bound to the grave, there was a fox foot and the eagle.
Yes.
Yeah, what was the significance of that?
So the question is, what were the significance of the animal parts? Specifically, I couldn't tell you. But the use of animal parts is a pretty frequent way of keeping somebody in a grave, either because the animal symbolically will guard the body or prevent the body from leaving, or perhaps the animal has some sort of specific magical association. You may remember in the tale of the two peasants walking around with coffins, it says that sometimes they go abroad as bears, sometimes they go abroad as dogs, werewolves, and werebears. Right, I mean, that's where that particular idea comes from. So that gives you your animalistic presence. They're also doing something else, and this is something that I perhaps should have emphasized a little bit more in my talk, and that is that the bodies that arise, we typically assume that they are bodies of people who are evil. But as we said last time, witchcraft accusations often are attached to a person or a dead person simply by the coincidence of proximity. So you might have a baby, and your baby passes away. Next week, the plague comes through your village. Is it the baby that's responsible? And this may be the source of the idea that there's this tension between the person themselves or the person's body being inhabited by a demon, right? Your innocent baby couldn't possibly be rising out of its grave and actually, sucking people's blood or doing anything. But if the baby's body has become the venue for demonic possession, especially if you as a parent are feeling a bit guilty about not getting your baby baptized in time, the corpse may be perfectly innocent, and you're just trying to sort of mediate the idea that it potentially poses a threat a different way. Yes?
Going back to your extra long...
Isn't it hilarious?
When the ring was created,
Yeah.
if they gave it to a living person, that would give them the appearance of being dead. But if you used it on a dead body, they came alive for 6 days. To what end?
That is actually very seldom explained. I mean, there are certainly spells that have clear purposes. The most common example being love spells, which if I had one more class, that would be the topic. But in some sense, a practice or an experiment or a ritual like that one, the goal is more the imagination of power. How could I figure a ritual that would summon a demon? As I said in the first class, right, magic is really very much about fantasy, right? A way of expressing desires through the medium of the supernatural. And part of the purpose of an elaborate ritual like that, or at least imagining that ritual or composing it on the page, is about just imagining the power of bringing a body back to life. So you're not necessarily, say, as a necromancer or as somebody who is imagining themselves to be a necromancer at that point, really thinking like, I'm going to bring this body back to life so that it will go and eat my next door neighbor. It's about this idea, what would it be like to have the power to bring a body back to life? What sorts of things would be imagined? What are the other sorts of spells that I've read about that I think are pretty cool and I could incorporate? What kind of crazy demon names can I come up with? There's not a huge jump from a lot of this material to Dungeons and Dragons. Yes?
Just a kind of a comment. You've got the monks who are buried with no clothes, nothing. They're buried just in a grave.
Mm-hmm.
Where you take, my wife, for example, is in a concrete vault,
Mm-hmm.
a casket, and so kind of reading in between the lines, the Catholics want the monks to come back. They want people like my wife or everybody in that category to be sure they don't get back out.
Well, remember also, but many monks are also buried in the crypts of churches, in the crypts of monasteries. So there, you make sure you've got a church sitting right on top of them, making sure that they don't leave. In fact, the idea of concrete burial or burial within stones goes all the way back to prehistoric times. And even today, we find Bronze Age or Stone Age graves. The technical term for them is kists, that have been lined with stones or designed so that the stones protect the influx of earth. It's really wonderful when you are at an excavation or watching an excavation and they find a burial like this, and for whatever reason, the grave hasn't been disturbed by dirt, and they actually open it and there is this real hole in the ground with actually a skeleton in it. Especially when some of the skeletons I showed here, it's clearly been rearranged in order to prevent it from getting up and walking away. Yes?
In conjunction with what you said about keeping bodies in the ground, is that perhaps where the, legend or practice of church grims came from?
Of church, sorry?
Church grims?
Yeah. Yes. And also, later practices like the bell in the grave and things like that. I mean, it's all about this idea of making sure your body doesn't get up and move and that you are adequately protected if it should. Other questions? Well, folks, it's been a great 4 weeks. Thank you all for coming out. And I like being able to give a class where I can now say, don't try any of this at home.